Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at the ISAS India Election Watch webinar series titled Impact of the Media. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following speakers. Ms. Shahana Sheikh, PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Kiran Garimella, Assistant Professor of Library and Information Science at Rutgers University. Mr. Naresh Fernandez, editor at Scroll.in. Professor Kishle Bhattacharjee, Professor and Dean, General School of Journalism and Communication, and Dr. Narayan Lakshman, Senior Associate Editor, The Hindu, and Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Today's session is chaired by Dr. Ronojoy Sen, who is a Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead of the Politics, Society and Governance Cluster at ISAS. Today's session will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page, and I shall now invite Dr. Sen to commence the discussion.
Thank you, Raghav. A very warm welcome to the fourth and final panel discussion of a series organized by ISAS on the ongoing Indian general elections titled India Election Watch. India's general elections, the world's largest electoral exercise, is being held in seemingly never-ending 7 phases from 19th April to 1st June, with the polling for the third phase on even as we speak. We began the series nearly a month and a half ago with a discussion on whether the BJP and Prime Minister Modi's claim of winning 370 seats on its own and 400 with allies was viable, going on to then examine the role of identity politics and the place of economic issues and welfare benefits in elections. Today's topic, a role of the media, has come to increasingly occupy a critical place in analyzing election campaigns and results, not just in India, but globally. The media's role could be very broadly split into 2 issues. One is an older question of how the media covers elections and whether it is neutral or not. The other is a relatively newer question of the impact of digital and social media, which is increasingly a central component of campaigning and targeting and reaching out to voters. On the first, one of the disturbing elements of contemporary Indian democracy is a media that was once held up as largely free and vibrant, but is now seen to be disseminating the government line or is too afraid to criticize the state. One has to cast an eye on the World Freedom Index, where India was ranked an abysmal 159 out of 180 countries in 2024, which is marginally better placed than countries like Russia and worse than Pakistan, to confirm the perilous state of the Indian media. Even if we quibble with India's low rankings, the index gives a sense of how the Indian media is perceived outside India's borders. It is also a reflection of the captured nature of the media, highly concentrated media ownership, and regular intimidation of journalists. There is even a popular and pejorative term, the Godi media, which sort of translates into laptop media, to describe many of the media outlets in India. The second issue is the outsized role played by digital media, where online sources and platforms have become the primary source of information for much of India's population. This is accompanied by a phenomenal spike in misinformation and fake news. There have been a fair number of studies that have mapped the influence of digital media on both election campaigns and how voters receive such information. Indeed, ISAS had published a brief survey of these trends for the 2019 general elections, which saw the widespread and innovative use of digital media and technology. Most political parties employed digital media both in English and vernacular languages extensively for campaigning and voter mobilization in 2019, which was in a sense pioneered by the BJP in 2014. The extensive use of digital media was due to nearly half of India's then 900 or so million eligible voters having access to the internet and social media. This had led the 2019 election being dubbed by some as the WhatsApp election. Such methods have only been refined and amplified in 2024. However, this has by no means displaced physical campaigning, election rallies, roadshows, and door-to-door visits by candidates. I'm just back from India for a brief 2-week visit to check out the Indian election campaign and can attest to the vigor with which both party leaders as well as individual candidates are campaigning in the intense heat. To discuss the impact of the media in all its complexity, we have an exciting and packed panel spread across time zones, with some of the panelists occupying senior positions in prominent media outlets in India. Each panelist will speak for roughly about 10 minutes, followed by a discussion. Members of the audience can send their questions via the chat or the question answer mode at any point of time. May I now, without further ado, invite Shahana to speak on how in-person campaigning and online campaigning interact and shape each other in India. Over to you, Shahana.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sen, and to everyone at ISAS at NUS for organizing this webinar. I've been following the work of the Institute since my master's days at NUS. So it's been over a decade that I've been following their work. And so it's really an honor to be at this webinar as a panelist. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm going to structure my comments in two parts. I'll begin with speaking about how social media is influencing election campaigns of political parties in India. I will then speak about the ways in which social media has been shaping party organization, which I think is important for us to understand because it's often the backbone of a lot of campaigns that are conducted by parties in the country. For my remarks, I'll be drawing on my dissertation research, including quantitative as well as qualitative evidence from intensive fieldwork that I carried out across multiple party campaigns held in India from 2019 to 2022. So before I get into my remarks, I would like to just set the context. India epitomizes the communication technology revolution that has been transpiring across the world. In the early 1990s, it could take months to obtain a new landline phone connection, which was considered a luxury at the time. But fast forward just a few decades, and we see the use of internet-enabled phones, i.e. smartphones, is widespread in the country now. These phones can be bought over the counter within minutes, and their rapidly growing use is enabled by their affordable prices, as well as mobile internet data, which is amongst the cheapest in the world. By 2022, smartphone penetration in India had reached around 66%. Smartphones are the primary device that Indians use to access social media and messaging apps such as WhatsApp. As Dr. Sen just noted, observers consider the 2019 national parliamentary election in India to be famously the WhatsApp election. Indians are also heavy smartphone users. As per a survey conducted in 2022, on average, Indians were spending nearly 5 hours per day on their smartphones. Much of this was on social media and video sharing apps. Puzzlingly, even in this fast-changing media and technology context, in-person mass rallies, a traditional form of campaigning during election campaigns, persist in India. So what explains parties' continued use of mass campaign rallies, which are expensive to organize, time-consuming, and labor-intensive in today's digital age, when parties can use low-cost online campaigning to conduct targeted voter outreach? So more broadly, how does social media really influence party campaigns? Existing scholarship on how new communication technologies will affect party campaigns belongs to two schools of thought. The first, often summarized as the innovation hypothesis, suggests that online campaigning will substitute in-person traditional forms of campaigning. As internet use and social media use becomes more and more widespread, campaigns are predicted to go online under this hypothesis, and physical forms of campaigning are expected to become obsolete. The second school of thought, often summarized as the normalization hypothesis, emphasizes that even as the use of new communication technologies, such as the internet and social media, rises, traditional forms of campaigning will remain central to campaigns, and this form of campaigning will merely be replicated online. Now, in India, online party campaigns have not replaced in-person party campaigns, and traditional in-person party campaigns are not being simply reproduced on social media. In my dissertation research, I find that party campaigns in India leverage a content complementarity, which I define as a mutually reinforcing synergistic relationship between online and in-person campaigning. Social media creates a perpetual demand for online content, and mass campaign rallies are able to provide valuable content to political parties. Moreover, the demand for online content and its anticipated, persuasive, and mobilizing effects also shapes how in-person physical forms of campaigning, especially mass campaign rallies, are conducted. This means that in today's digital age, in addition to previously documented purposes of rallies, such as solving within party asymmetric information and enabling clientelistic exchanges, rallies today serve an additional purpose. They provide parties with online content, and this boosts their importance. In advance of an upcoming campaign rally, a party will broadcast information about it on social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and WhatsApp to mobilize lower level party functionaries and voters. After a rally's conclusion, a party will select specific photographs, speech excerpts, sound bites, and displays of enthusiasm from the rally to share on social media platforms. In an increasingly online world, a party feels compelled to show voters real-world evidence that it has support of other voters like them. Voters see that real-world evidence as vital in evaluating a party's fit with their interests. Voters also interpret physical campaigning as indicative of a party's prospects for electoral success. My analysis of Twitter data of leading political parties during recent state elections held in Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh in 2022 and 2023, respectively, found that as much as 35 to 40% of party content during official campaign periods relates to mass campaign rallies, with an overwhelming share of this content being post-rally content. Party circulation of post-rally content is not limited to Twitter. Among the approximately 400 party functionaries from the Bharatiya Janata Party or the BJP and the Samajwadi Party or the SP, whom I surveyed in Uttar Pradesh in 2022, just after the state election held there, 90% of the party functionaries said that they posted photographs and or videos of their party's rallies on WhatsApp and or on Facebook. Moreover, among the nearly 2,000 respondent voters whom I surveyed in Uttar Pradesh, who were also smartphone users, in this particular context of the 2022 state election, 53% of them reported having seen photographs and or videos of campaign rallies on their smartphones at least once a day in the lead up to the election. This repeated exposure to rally content has the potential to influence voters. In my research, through survey experiments that I conducted with voters in Uttar Pradesh, I found that rally content in terms of visuals and narratives about rally crowds affects voter perceptions as well as voter mobilization. In addition to leveraging content complementarity for party voter linkages, parties also utilize this complementarity for establishing and sustaining intra-party linkages. Each of India's leading political parties today has an organizational vertical variously referred to as a party's IT and social media cell or department, team, or wing. This particular organizational vertical is dedicated to social media tasks. These organizational verticals operate from a party's top level, such as at the national or the state level, down to its lowest level, such as at the polling station or the polling booth level. The core functions of these IT and social media organizational units include content creation, content dissemination, and content monitoring. The demand for intra-party online content raises the importance of in-person party events and shapes how they are conducted. Online content associated with in-person party events fosters intra-party online engagement between party elites, party functionaries across hierarchy levels within a party, as well as grassroots level party workers. To disseminate online content, political parties attempt to establish robust networks online. In my survey of party functionaries in Uttar Pradesh after the 2022 state election campaigns held there, I found that WhatsApp and Facebook are almost used universally by these functionaries for party purposes. There was a high intensity of use of these two platforms during election campaigns, with party functionaries reporting use of Facebook on average around 40 to 50 times per day, and the use of WhatsApp for within party communication on average around 50 to 60 times per day. Yet, even in the months after the election, when I conducted this particular survey, party functionaries reported using WhatsApp on average 15 to 16 times per day for within party communication as well as communication with voters. This suggests that on average, party functionaries were using WhatsApp at least once every waking hour of the day. Equipped with organizational resources as well as online networks that span across a party's levels, together with a steady stream of content, a significant share of which is linked with party events, parties engage in continuous messaging on social media. Through messages that they circulate among their functionaries and workers, as well as supporters throughout the day on social media and messaging apps such as WhatsApp, parties reinforce partisan inclination and keep these party functionaries, workers, as well as party supporters in a constant state of mobilization. Changes in media and communication technology, which have been propelled by the digital revolution, are shaping election campaigns and party organization in India. The BJP has been the leading party in the online space, but other parties are catching up and investing in IT and social media organizational units to build their digital presence. These investments can bear fruit, but it ought to be recognized that there are limits to online-only campaigns. In the 2024 election and likely beyond, online campaigning is best utilized as a complement rather than as a substitute or simply adjunct to old-fashioned retail politicking. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shana, for those fascinating insights from your fieldwork. Would I now ask Kiran to throw some light on misinformation on WhatsApp, which is ubiquitous in India and on which Kiran has done significant research, and the use of WhatsApp in election campaigns. Over to you, Kiran.
All right, you can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. All right, so yeah, thanks, Shahana. I think it's a very good segue into some of this work. Obviously, yeah, whatever I'm gonna say here is conditioned on the fact that whatever Shahana said, given okay, these platforms are really big. Like WhatsApp is used by, let's say, 600 million Indians. But the political impacts of these might be, complementary, right? Like, I mean, it's not that you have a huge infrastructure and an operation on WhatsApp. It actually translates to electoral votes. I think that's a very good context to start this presentation on. So, I mean, I think Narendra also mentioned the fact that there is a lot of misinformation and propaganda that is spread through these social media platforms. Particularly, WhatsApp is the big one, but also the hardest one. Like people do not have a sense of how things are on WhatsApp. So basically, some of my research in general tries to answer all of these kinds of questions, like who is producing this misinformation, how much of it is there, who's consuming it, how much of it is consumed by normal people, how is it spread, what can we do about it? Like generally, these are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. Particularly today, I'm going to talk about this work that we're currently doing. So there's people on the field who are doing this right now. So whatever I'm going to show you is very preliminary work because we have some, this is ongoing stuff, but pretty exciting stuff. So basically, in general, there's not much stuff unless it's anecdotal and qualitative on WhatsApp. Large-scale quantitative evidence of the prevalence of various things like misinformation or propaganda don't exist because data collection from WhatsApp is very hard, right? Like, so the first and most important reason is that this is private data. A lot of WhatsApp is one-to-one communication. The other is also a very WhatsApp specific thing, which is end-to-end encryption. So because of encryption, even WhatsApp does not store or know the content that is spreading on their platform. So if I send a message to someone else, WhatsApp only knows that A sent a message to B. They don't know what the content of the message is. So they really cannot do anything about stopping the spread of misinformation, for instance, because of encryption. So the model we follow for getting data is through this model called data donation, which is basically a privacy preserving opt-in model where users give us as researchers access to the groups that they are a part of. Okay. And the way we get these groups is by an on-ground survey in various parts of India and Brazil. I'm going to focus on India in this talk. But basically what happens is we have people on the field, a survey firm, they go to a person's house, they explain our procedure, get consent, and get the data. Basically, what's happening here is that this person in the pink shirt is the person who's donating the data. The person in the blue shirt has a phone, which is a phone where we are running some software. And the person in the red shirt scans a QR code through which they're able to consent and provide their data for our research study. And we do this over and over. And overall, for India, currently we have around 1,600 users recruited in UP, only in Uttar Pradesh, across different age groups, castes, religions, uh, and locations around UP. This gave us around 4,000 WhatsApp groups, which are private WhatsApp groups from these people, giving us 6 million messages, which is a very large scale view of the types of content that is spreading on WhatsApp. So in these groups, we get everything that is shared within those groups. Particularly, we are interested in looking at viral content. This is content that has been forwarded many times on WhatsApp. So, WhatsApp marks content that has been forwarded at least 5 hops from the original sender as forwarded many times. On a network, 5 hops is a lot of people. So these messages are potentially seen by a very, very large number of people. So what we did is we manually annotated around 2,000 messages from a few months ago. So this is, the data collection is ongoing, but the annotation is not ongoing. So whatever results I'm going to show you are from a few months ago. And this was done by a journalist who's well versed with the local knowledge. And we annotated for many things, but I'm going to show you results for prevalence of these 3 things: misinformation, hate speech, and political propaganda. So I'm going to show you this. The y-axis is what is the fraction of messages that we coded as being in any of these categories. Okay. Firstly, misinformation. 1 in 8 messages, so that's around 12% of the messages we coded, are misinformation. So this is a very high number compared to a baseline on other platforms. I mean, there's no baseline to compare on WhatsApp, but when people did studies on Twitter or Facebook, the amount of misinformation on those platforms is usually in the low single digits, 2 to 5%. So here it's much higher. Obviously, these are not comparable, but just to show you that this is a high number, 12% misinformation. Again, think of the context. So, out of the viral content that people are receiving, 1 in 8 of those is misinformation. Similarly, even more worrying is 1 in 10 messages being hate speech. All of these are viral messages, meaning they're being forwarded many times by the people. So 1 in 10 messages are hateful, most of them being hateful against Muslims. And then the final most worrying stuff is 1 in 12 messages, so that's 8% of the messages, are propaganda. And most of the propaganda is by one side, one particular party, which has very well planned and has infrastructure that can create and spread these types of messages. But the surprising and interesting thing is how it's one thing to create groups and spread these messages. You can have these IT cells that create that content. What this shows is that a lot of the normal people on WhatsApp are actually consuming this and forwarding them organically. So this is what is really surprising. It shows the effectiveness of BJP's political propaganda and other, along with that, along other forms of content that is being spread. And there is a lot of overlap across these. So, it's not that, misinformation, hate speech, there's a lot of overlap across them. Okay, so overall, again, like the cautionary thing here is that misinformation may be very rare, like in the sense that, so what I'm talking about is only frequently forwarded content. So this is the viral content, so which is only 1% of your entire consumption. So it doesn't, what I showed you doesn't mean that 1 in 8 pieces of content that I get is misinformation. It's just 1 in 8 viral pieces of content is misinformation. So that's a very important difference. So users are not drowning in misinformation. It's just that whatever is viral, a lot of that is misinformation. The other is these sorts of extremely high prevalence of hate speech and propaganda. Again, the amount of politics that people consume is very low usually, but here, 8% of the content being propaganda means it's a very, very high number. The third important thing is these are all organically viral, irrespective of whether the BJP has the infrastructure to create all of this, unless people forward them, and we are seeing that, right? Like forwarded many times. So many times people have forwarded these. There is buy-in bottom up for this type of content. So these are all organically viral. So the other one thing, the journalists here, so I just, whenever I'm with anyone, like, okay, AI is the buzzword now. So I also wanted to have some slides about generative AI very quickly. So generative AI is not an issue as we see in our data, right? Like, only less than 1% of the content we see is generative AI. So the role of generative AI as a huge issue in the current election, we don't see that in the data. I mean, obviously, there are very interesting and novel ways of using generative AI. So, for instance, okay, a lot of misleading content is generated using generative AI, which is what it can quickly do. For instance, okay, these are all images claiming to be a new train station in Ayodhya, for instance, right? Like these are not all generative AI, but they claim to be a train station. Okay, this one is like claimed to be natural tree formation. It's not. This is claims to be Israel's victory over Gaza and their dominance. There's a lot of pro-Israel content, by the way. It's again generative AI content. Then there is a lot of Hindu supremacy content, which just shows these are the muscular guys, Hindu guys. So there's a lot of that type of content. Then there's also hate speech content, which is very simply generated. Like, so this is just, a generative AI image, but the guy is speaking. So he's saying something, you cannot hear the audio, but the lip syncing is done through AI. And, the same is done with a woman, like this is generative AI picture. But then she's saying something about like, how we, Muslims are getting a lot of freebies and things like that. Okay, so that's the third category, second category of hateful content. The final category is, a bunch of like miscellaneous stuff, like a lot of religious content, a lot of inspirational, good morning kind of content generated using generative AI, a lot of memes. This is, funny, like funny one about. I mean, one thing I always think of is, the person creating this, what were they thinking? But anyway, so this is Gandhi claiming to be supporting Palestine or something, very creative. But these sorts of memes are also present in the data. Anyway, so the takeaway is that generative AI is not common. Obviously, there are worrying signs that it is being used to automate the generation of misinformation, hate speech. That worry we should always have. But the most important thing is there's so much more, like maybe 10 to 50 times more normal hate speech and misinformation. So worrying about AI as a big thing that really dooms the democracy, I don't think that's happening, at least right now. And also, a lot of this is very easy to produce, like misinformation taken out of context, for instance. A lot of that is that. The only thing that generative AI in the current setup produces is this sort of novelty aspect. Like if you want a monk who's buffed like this, who has muscles, it's very hard to generate. I mean, find someone like that, but it's very easy to generate this using generative AI. So there's this sort of novelty aspect, but other than that, like there's no, it's not being widely used. Okay, so very quickly, like fact checking as a solution here in this case, at least in our data on WhatsApp, it does not exist. A lot of the misinformation we've coded has already been fact checked, sometimes multiple times, even going back to 10 years ago. It just these fact checks do not reach these populations that we are sampling. This is a good example. So this is Rahul Gandhi praying as a Muslim image that has been threading since very, very long ago, and it's been fact checked like every year almost by one of the few big names in India, fact checkers. It just doesn't stop, like because fact checking does not reach these audiences on WhatsApp. And we're trying to provide some of this data, not live during the election, but potentially after the election, we have some dashboards that enable the release of some, like what was the viral content that spread during the election. Might happen. If you're interested, contact me after the election. So yeah, so important thing is, okay, there's high prevalence of misinformation, hate speech, and political propaganda in the viral content, not overall. Generative AI, not an issue in our data set. Yeah, what can we do, like in terms of protecting and stopping the spread of such misinformation? I'm not sure. I don't have a clear solution. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kiran. Once again, fascinating data and insights into the WhatsApp ecosphere in India, and thanks for those images, including the one of the muscular monk. It seems to be quite popular these days. So we can now turn to Naresh, who will focus on online media and the election campaign, and perhaps talk a little bit about his personal experience of being an editor of an independent media organization in these fraught times. Naresh, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good morning from Bombay. I know it's evening where some of you are perhaps in the US. Um, sometime in 2013, a word that had been confined to the realms of literary theory burst out of university seminar rooms and invaded the op-ed columns of newspapers and the discussions in television studios. Suddenly, Hindutva ideologues were everywhere explaining why it was essential to create a narrative if the BJP was going to be successful in its campaign to capture power. They appropriated a word from the Litcrit types to describe their mega project to disseminate a story that claims to explain various events in history and gives meaning by connecting disparate events and phenomena by appealing to some kind of universal knowledge. As everyone who lives in India or follows Indian life closely knows, the BJP has used every possible medium to batter down the old assumptions on which the state rested and conjure up new narrative pillars on which the Saffron Republic can be founded. There's WhatsApp, as Kiran Jana just told us, with its barrage of Islamophobia, pseudo sociology, and humbug history. There are YouTube influencers with their soft touch interviews of leading BJP politicians. There are a swarm of screamy websites blasting out conspiracy theories about how the BJP government and its supporters, which is to say all right-thinking Indians, are under attack from Soros-funded Islamo-fascists lurking within the borders of our sacred land. There are new textbooks and names of streets and cities being changed to drive home this new narrative. And reinforcing all of this is the news media, print, but especially television, crawling cravenly even before it was asked to even bend. Uh, as it turns out, a great many of the journalists in India's newsrooms actually subscribe to the majoritarian agenda of the ruling party. But also, the government spends millions of dollars on advertising, and that, in the age of shaky media economics, is vital for the survival of many media groups. Just how eagerly the media has taken its role of proclaiming the greater glory of Narendra Modi and his government is obvious from a survey that our colleagues at News Laundry published last fortnight. They patiently sat through 429 primetime segments by 6 anchors on 6 prominent TV channels, a task for which I hope its reporters were given hardship pay. Their findings were stark. Out of the 429 segments that they reviewed, 224 or 52 of the total had anti-opposition themes, News Laundry said. Meanwhile, 116 segments, or 27% of the total, were dedicated to praising Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his government. Muslims, as you know, are being blamed for waging a variety of jihads against India. Love jihad, spit jihad, flood jihad, fertilizer jihad, and now by exercising their right to go out and choose their representatives, they are evidently waging a vote jihad. Only 5%, only 5 shows, which was 1% of the total they reviewed, were dedicated to subjects you think that really matter to voters: jobs and education. There was very little coverage, for instance, of the fallout of the revelation of the data on electoral bonds. And that, I admit, was rather disappointing for those of us in the independent media. For us, the release of the data had been the opportunity to forge a collaboration with our colleagues in other organizations in March, so that we could throw as many bodies and minds at this enormous tranche of information that had been suddenly released. For weeks, reporters from News Laundry, the News Minute, and Scroll, and about 15 independent journalists had worked together in makeshift teams to chart the pattern showing who had given the money to which party and how their donations had benefited, had coincided with significant policy decisions that benefited the donors or followed raids on them from the enforcement authorities. In other democracies, this information coming just before a national election would have been the central issue on which voters made their decision. But the television channels have been so devoted in their task of protecting the Indian people from all unsettling news about the ruling party. The electoral bonds data has barely caused even a ripple in this campaign. In the middle of March at India Today, at the India Today Media Group's annual conclave, the group's executive editor in chief articulated a startling rationalization for the approach to the news you see on her channel and many others. The media cannot play the role of the opposition, she said. If the opposition is in disarray, the media cannot be blamed for it. We cannot present another side equally strongly if it doesn't exist. We are observers in this boxing match. We are not players, she said. If one side is weak or doesn't show up, we cannot jump into the ring. This is not fear. This is a matter of roles, rules, and competence. We are the medium, not the message, she concluded. It was as if she was repudiating the courage displayed by her own publication over the preceding decades in holding the powerful to account. But by invoking these imaginary rules, she brought into focus one of the many challenges faced by the media today, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world, including the US. It's like we, the media, have shuffled into the stadium to cover a child's game of tag or perhaps kabaddi. But one team on the field is actually playing like it's a bout of mixed martial arts. They're punching and kicking and clamping their opponents in headlocks. But the media, with its necessary conventions of objectivity and detachment, lacks the framework to call this out. In the US, journalists have started to debate about this when they were faced with the challenge of covering Donald Trump with his endless stream of alternative facts. In a podcast not so long ago, the New Yorker attempted to raise some important issues. What is the line between coverage and promotion? It asked. What is the role of news organizations in the age of political polarization? Perhaps we in India need to listen more closely to these debates to see what answers our American counterparts are coming up with. But there's a significant difference between the climate in which the media in the two countries operates. Unlike the US media, the Indian media, as you all know, is under intense political pressure. Um, as we were just told, India's score in the press freedom rankings compiled by Reporters Without Borders has constantly been declining, and it declined again this year. 7 journalists are in jail for simply doing their jobs, 4 of them in Jammu and Kashmir. 5 of these 7 have been charged under an anti-terrorism law, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Several independent news organizations have been gently urged to stay within the lines by setting the tax authorities loose on them. The attempt to police the independent media should be seen within the context of the attacks on other civil society organizations, the hobbling and disabling of NGOs and think tanks believed to be critical of India, which is to say, critical of the BJP. We have to remember, of course, that a great many Indians approve of the strong arm tactics of the ruling party. Modi remains immensely popular among people who believe that a spell of dictatorship would do us all some good. In this age of polarization, the opposition has come to be viewed by a great many BJP supporters as deeply unpatriotic, even treasonous. That is obvious from the responses we received to our reports. For instance, after we ran a report on a big India Alliance rally in Delhi at the end of March, one reader wrote in with a heartfelt request. Please don't spoil our brotherhood, he said. In this age of shrinking attention spans, voters don't seem to remember how Modi's various autocratic masterstrokes have upended their lives. The misery that followed demonetization in 2016, for instance, or the horrors of the COVID lockdown. They don't even seem to care about the consequences of the electoral bond purchases that became evident only last month. As journalists attempting to do our jobs the way we're supposed to do them, we have to keep going in our attempts to speak truth to powers with the techniques we've always used, with rigorous reporting and objective analysis. We may not be able to show up the flaws in the narrative they're attempting to project, but at least we can try to leave a record of the tumultuous times through which we're living. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Naresh, for mapping out the fraught situation in India and offering at least an antidote through your website to much of what we are seeing. We now turn to Kishala. Kishala, besides being dean and professor at Jindal University, also had an earlier avatar as a television journalist. Could I request him, among other things, to focus on news television, which of course Naresh referred to, vis-a-vis the election campaign, with some references to his time with the news channel, of course, at a time when things weren't probably so partisan. Kishala, floor is yours.
Thanks, Ranjay. Hello to everyone. I've been, as you mentioned, I've been doing the election for a fairly long time. Seems like actually pretty ancient now, because from the 93 onwards, I think I've been doing this. And this year, I'm not covering elections. I no longer report, but as an observer, I can tell you, it is perhaps the most boring election ever in India. Elections in India was like the big fat Indian wedding. I mean, it is the time when there is color, there is money. You have the barakhanas that the politicians throw to the voters. It is a time of almost celebration in a bad way, good way, whatever you call it. But it is the time of celebration. It is also the only time, it used to be the only time when reporters had the luxury of covering India. Because, whether it was in the 90s or whether it is in the 2000s or whether it is now, newsrooms in India never cover India. So it's a myth that there is any coverage of India. There is only 5% coverage of India. The Delhi newsroom doesn't even cover South India. And, once I remember in the survey we had done, 60% of then, English language viewership was from south of India. And yet my South Delhi newsroom would cover only South Delhi primarily, or Central Delhi. Even East or West Delhi was not covered. So, I teach a course called Off Center, and I think that, the Off Center was like, where I am speaking to you from, Sonipat, which is 42 kilometers from Delhi, and is the NCT, the National Capital Territory. And I disappeared twice in between because I've had a power cut. I have like about 10 power cuts in the day in 2024, just to give you a sense of, what kind of electrification is happening across India. It used to be the time when we would come to Sonipat and cover a story. Today, that luxury is gone. It's not just today. It's actually by about 2010, either revenues were plummeting or for some other reason, newsrooms resorted to opinion pieces in the newspapers and talking heads in television channels. It cut down cost. It was safe. Sending a reporter like me to Ladakh or to Lakshadweep is very expensive. You get 2 or 3 stories out of it. It doesn't satisfy or it doesn't justify the funders or the people who run media. And I think out here we need to make a difference right at the outset. When you say impact of the media, are we talking of impact of journalism or impact of media? Because media is ownership, and ownership we know today is tilted on the side of the power. Let me also share this little anecdote which happened last week. I was at a lecture, and listening to the lecture, I actually forgot that I'm supposed to be asking a seminar kind of a question. So I asked, just a question that one would ask at a press conference. A just retired, very successful IS officer was speaking on why India is on the high table, the global high table. And he was talking about how there's been the power rivalry is completely shifted. The Russia-Ukraine war has collapsed all dynamics, etc., etc. And I asked him a fairly simple question, saying that, why did India continue to buy coal and oil from Russia? Because they could still buy from Australia, South Africa, and Indonesia at the cost of course, they kept buying at the cost of financing the war. And the gentleman, of course, lost his cool. He was very rude. And there were a number of other journalists in the room. No one else asked any other question. It was fairly amiable the rest of the evening. After the lecture, I asked, some journalists came and said that, thanks for asking that question. And I asked them, I said, why didn't you all ask him some questions? And they said that if we asked him a question, it is guaranteed that we wouldn't get invitation or entry to any government press conferences later. Now, I don't know whether that's an exaggerated position, but if that is the fear of journalists in central Delhi, then the state of journalism is not obviously very good. And I'm just kind of corroborating it with an anecdote that happened recently. So, you all talked about digital media. Some of you talked about WhatsApp. Naresh mentioned YouTube. I think researchers call the 2014 election the Twitter election, the 2019 election WhatsApp election, and the 2024 election YouTube election. I'll just add one more thing that has happened in 2024 election is the use of Bollywood. I think cinema, for the first time, in the last election, there were only 2 movies or just one movie, the Uri. But this time, it's they started with Savarkar, then they have JNU. There's one movie called Godra coming up. There's Aakhir Palay Kab Tak, the Razakars, Article 370, the Kashmir Files, Kerala Story. It's a large body of cinema that's actually reaching out to the people. So they are using all forms. So it's not just digital media, which I am not very sure of what the penetration is in terms of vote conversion. Movies also, I'm not saying it's going to be vote conversion, but, and I'll come to the point of the impact of the media. Not just Bollywood productions, the Bollywood celebrities. I mean, whether for fear or for opportunism, it's unbelievable of how many Bollywood celebrities were seen at the Ram Temple inauguration or for anything. I mean, just look at how Bollywood now has become also a campaign machinery, and not just several editors and newsrooms who continue to be mouthpieces of the government. And newsrooms and have not become mouthpieces of the government suddenly overnight. There were always there was always a shade of being opportunist in some cases in the previous during the previous government of the first NDA term. Say, for example, there were 2 ministers, let me tell you their names, on which the newsroom still about 2010 did not do any real good story. And one was Arun Jaitley, the other was Chidambaram. And people said that, that they had the journalists in their pockets. And literally so, I mean, late Mr. Jaitley, a wonderful warm man, would, loved throwing his little chai parties and majlis, and, he loved chole bhature. And, the journalists loved that. They knew how to seduce the journalists. They knew how to, get the journalists not to write the stories. So there was one chief minister of Assam called Hiteshwar Saikia, a Congress chief minister, very astute, Hiteshwar Saikia every evening, I'm told, would actually land up in one newspaper editor's office, the newspaper that would actually do news against him. And he would sit out there. Now, after a chief minister is sitting in your office for 1 hour having chai pakoda, it becomes difficult for the editor now to write an editorial against this man who is just met. So, and Hiteshwar Saikia would do that very meticulously. So there have been politicians earlier, but this is now a more collective, effort that they're doing. Now, the role of the media, I think, when you're asking the impact of the media, and when I'm saying impact of the media, I'm keeping it to journalism, and I'm not talking about the media as an ownership. But the role of the journalist today has been reduced to a fact checker. I mean, the amount of time that reporters are now spending trying to fact check the news is enormous. I mean, we are not doing any more reportage. So like I said, that the reportage anyway had reduced by 2010. There are only few organizations, outlets that can cover. But if Naresh makes his best effort in covering all of India, the footprint is going to be very large. It requires resources. So he will obviously prioritize his resources. He's going to send his people to Manipur, which requires more attention in 2024, rather than sending to Arunachal Pradesh or sending to, for example, Sikkim, where still, for the last 12, 15 years, there's been a relay hunger strike on the dams on Teesta. People have forgotten. Though these are stories that this was the time, this report card on the government every 5 years was the opportunity for journalists to cover India, and that impact is gone completely. So there is no impact in that sense. If you're talking about only about the narrative of the BJP or of any other party and how the media is conveying in that image and that narrative, maybe that works. But there is, when I am saying impact, I would say the impact of the journalism, of reportage, of media is to be able to cover India from tip to toe. And that has not happened. Kashmir this time is not being covered as much as it used to be. It was once upon a time one of the areas where journalists would flock to go. I mean, for example, the infrastructure construction going on in Andaman Islands, the Nicobar Islands, not being covered by which endangers the ecology out there. That has not been covered. I just use the Media Cloud software to randomly to figure out what between 11th March to now, what has been the coverage of electoral bonds versus the Ram Mandir. And the electoral bonds, it throws up, and I'm using only English language, I'm not using other language media, but it's 0.07% attention. And it peaked only for 5 days between 11th to 15th March. That was all. And electoral bonds should have had a larger coverage, deeper coverage. The attention span should have been there. Ram Mandir, which was inaugurated long back, but the curve continues to go up as the election comes closer. So the media coverage of the Ram Mandir versus the electoral bonds, if you just take these two, and you can make several other comparisons, is quite obvious. But I mean, even the data will tell you that the curve is way up than any other thing. So the coverage during election campaign of the Ram Mandir versus the coverage of any other issues, again, is way much. And the media, of course, is covering. So the impact of the media, if you say, is tremendous. because the ruling party had claimed the newsrooms, long ago. However, I continue. I mean, I'll come back to, and I'll close out here, come back to say that it is still a lackluster, boring election for a journalist. It's not a journalist's delight of an election, really. It is something that I don't regret not covering. And I'll stop here of my unstructured little few remarks, Ranjay.
Thank you, Kushal, for those insights into how newsrooms have changed, perhaps quite dramatically over the last decade or 12 years or so. And also your sort of interesting remark on the nature of the election and the campaign, which we can come back to during the Q&A time. Finally, we turn to Narendra, who will speak, drawing on his experience as an editor with one of India's oldest and largest English dailies on the print media and how it's been covering the elections. Narendra?
Sure. Hi, thank you, Ranjoy, and it's very, very fascinating to listen to all of you on the multiple dimensions of the media itself and how each part is behaving and the innovation that's happening in the current space to take on the challenge that is reporting this democratic exercise that is the 2024 election. I found myself nodding to many of the comments made, but equally, some of the sort of the broader conclusions that not just on this panel, but that one draws about the media in general in India, when you think about the media as an entity, I felt that there are interesting exceptions, and I don't mean obviously just the Hindu sitting from my vantage point, but specifically within the print media, I think there's a greater level of diversity, quality variation, and the ability to be independent than a lot of the stereotypes about the media would admit. So obviously the stereotypes about the media being wholesale, literally purchased by the political ruling class have come about for a certain reason. And that's because of egregious displays of bias and prejudice over many decades. I mean, it predates 2014 and the BJP, but certainly has accelerated since that time. But having said that, there are very interesting regional variations. So for example, print media in the South, to a large extent, stands apart from many of the northern and even the vernacular presses. There's a variation in terms of size. So what would a lawsuit or a bunch of lawsuits and maybe even physical threats that would capsize a small Hindi vernacular press somewhere in the Hindi heartland in Uttar Pradesh would not impact a larger media house based in Kerala or Tamil Nadu, where the state governments in those states themselves offer a dissenting voice, an alternative voice to the mainstream political messaging that's coming out of New Delhi from the BJP or another party in an earlier time. So I think it's important to keep at the back of one's mind that there is this variation. And as journalists, we these days, of course, for the last several decades, I shouldn't say these days, we have been swamped by the sense of hopelessness, not just due to the politics that surrounds us, but also the economics of what's happening in the media industry. I would like to just add a little footnote here that there is hope in terms of what media houses across the range are doing in the print space, especially to try and find ways through this economic and political headwinds that they're facing. So before delving right into the election aspect, let me just take a step back for some of our listeners and viewers who might want more background on this. What many of you in the panel alluded to in terms of why the electronic media has really sort of seized the momentum, and the print medium is in a sense almost now on the back foot and part of the base or the foundation or the history almost of the media story that we tell in India, is that there was a certain transition that we went through in the print sector. And that, as I just alluded, has to do both with the politics and the economics. So let's look firstly at the economics of it. Obviously, since independence, the print media in India had a reputation of being lively, free, rambunctious, challenging, very much on the front foot, undertaking the core functions that a media would in a massive democracy such as India's, which is, investigative, journalism, which is a critical function, watchdog function, looking at where does the government perform and where does it fail to deliver, the informational aspect, looking at the broader social good. These are the pillars of traditional journalism, and the Indian media, print media in the early decades after independence very much upheld that. It came out of the broader sort of the Nehruvian paradigm, the Gandhi-Nehru paradigm, and sort of the ethos that pervaded free India at that time. But as the marketization of not just the economy, but of politics happened, the media too got marketized, and by fast forward well into the 80s and 90s. And you look at a situation where I think one of our panelists alluded to this, where the owners of media houses, by the way, which were largely family-based in many of the print media, English print media cases, and even in the vernacular press, many of these owners started realizing that there were creeping pressures on advertising revenue, and they had to therefore play ball with central and state governments in order to bolster their top line, and then do what they could to scramble and ensure that their bottom lines and what they gave as dividends to their shareholders continue to hold up and keep them a financially viable entity. So for multiple economic reasons, which had to do with the global newsprint industry and the sort of cyclical business cycle, the waves of the cyclicality that goes through, as well as changing labor costs, as well as other sort of capital-related factors in India, print media houses across the country began to pay ever more attention to that top line factor. So this basically handed over an enormous amount of leverage to central and state governments to influence what the owners of these businesses could and could not permit their operational leaders, that is the editors, to do in terms of criticizing, in terms of undertaking investigative stories and so forth. So there is a very real and palpable trend of the economics of the media industry creepingly and then with increasing, with accelerating speed, impacting the journalistic activity of these houses. So what happened after 2014 was not just that these factors intensified because of the BJP being in power, but then there was also the 2020 pandemic, and even pre-pandemic, there was a very dramatic shift towards digital news consumption habits. After the pandemic, even the older generations, which we at the Hindu, for example, would say were the ones we relied on to, open out their print newspaper, sit with their morning degree coffee, and enjoy an in-depth survey of the newspaper, which meant reading all through into the opinion pages and sports and business. Those habits collapsed completely. Add to that the news consumption habits of the new generation, which never even picked up a newspaper in the first place since the get-go. And you have a situation where there were readers who did not even know clearly the distinction between news or reportage and opinion. And I think one of our panelists alluded to this, that certainly fueled this fire, which took many more media houses towards also conflating those lines. And so, for example, you do look at television journalism today, and I'm often an anchor on TV shows. I'm astounded at how, forget about those lines between news and opinion. The very basis of the conversation that's happening is neither news nor opinion, but just a almost chaotic conflation of the two. And then one obviously has to ask, what is the purpose? What is the intent behind it? Who is driving the nature of these conversations and the influence that they exert on viewers? So these changes happened for the economic reasons within print media over the last decade. Combine that with, again, we saw this much more in the conversations on digital news. You have a government that very deliberately sought to expand its footprint in the digital media space, and to that extent also influence the way print media worked by actually taking over ownership of many of these houses, by doing backroom deals in terms of advertising revenue. I mean, without naming names, I'm very well aware of many of these media houses which have regular arrangements with central and state governments to actually get a certain proportion of budgeted ad revenue per year. And one can only imagine the impact that has on reportage. or possibly even on the opinion pages. So a startling case, even for those of us in the media industry, was NDTV, which was seen in many regards as the last holdout, both in digital media as well as in television media, as an independent voice. I mean, of course, Naresh, no offense, Scroll and many others still fight that brave fight and hold firm, hold the line. But NDTV was one of the major ones which actually saw these two sort of the titans of industry, the Adani and Ambani households, in a rare moment come together through their subsidiaries and parent holdings and shell corporations, and actually engineer what has been described as a hostile takeover of that news agency. And in a sense, that has been the sort of the manual, the sort of rule book by which this government has steadily crept upon and literally annihilated the ability of media to critique them. So there was a change in the economics which internally forced these print media houses and digital media as well to bow to the diktats of the political class. There was deliberate action coming from the political class to expand their footprint and to cover and to control the narrative coming out of the media. And finally, reader consumption habits, this you describe as a structural change, as I said, have also led to a shortage of models, of revenue models that actually work. So all of this put together has made for the 2024 election, has created a situation where it is pretty precarious for any media house to actually perform that fourth estate function, to actually be a critical, investigative watchdog voice with authenticity, with fact-checking, which the people can rely on. Now that there is an even deeper question, which is concerning to journalists across the board, regardless of which side of the fence you're on, which is, do voters and do readers of news and consumers of news even want such fact-checking? So do they want authenticity? Do they want us to question the netas as they were? Or is that line between news and entertainment blurring? So the other important aspect that several reports picked up on in the 2024 election is that this has actually been the election of influencers. So I think Naresh alluded to the fact that 2019 was the WhatsApp election. Then, there were other social media type elections in between. But this one has seen, the 2024 election has seen an enormous impact of influencers, especially again in the Hindi heartland, but even down south as well, where the political class, the leaders have been granting interviews, in-depth interviews to influencers who have literally hundreds of thousands of followers. And that sets up, again, a narrative that is highly personalized, because the influencer psychology is a very different one from a media house which has reporters who are trained, who have a certain tradition of verification and so forth. The influencer psychology is based much more on the sale of products by endorsement. And that is built on the psychology, again, of trust in the influencer, of admiration of the influencer. So you can imagine that when a political leader who maybe doesn't even have a fraction of the number of followers that an influencer has, grants exclusive interviews to them and goes viral, you are actually, in a sense, distorting democracy itself, because it is just another form of propaganda. And the 2024 election will have a lot more I think many more studies will come out of it that reflect that. So in terms of how, again, let me just, as Ranajay said, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we kind of held our own internal lines in the face of these enormous pressures. So one of the things we did at the Hindu, which we've done in the past as well, is to look at pre-poll surveys and to bring up the data that those surveys revealed. We have this organization called the CSDS Lokniti survey. And let me just share a few slides if I can. You see my share screen?
No, fortunately, we can't see your screen.
Okay. Okay. I think I'm having some trouble here sharing, but let me just go over it with you. So, for example, we looked at yeah. So we looked at, for example, big questions on what is the level of satisfaction and discontent with the dual narrative of the Modi government, which was on the one hand focusing on the core issues that come out of Hindutva and the politics of the BJP, but on the other hand, also make certain claims regarding the economy, which is of great concern. So, for example, one of the results that the survey found was that the satisfaction with the union government was actually less in 2024 than 2019 when you look at the realm of economic policy. So I think the main focus there obviously was economic hardships coming out of unemployment. Similarly, when you look at which classes were satisfied or dissatisfied with the Modi government, you found that the upper classes had a far greater level of satisfaction, 30% to 32% for fully and somewhat satisfied, relative to 20% and 16% for the poor. And similarly, 21% and 20% for the lower and middle classes. So at the same time, we looked at how did they respond to issues such as the Ram Mandir and the Uniform Civil Code. So there again, if you separate it by which class of respondents you have, is it Hindus or Muslims or SC, ST or OBCs, you find that Hindu respondents, for example, believe much more that the Ram Mandir would have a unifying effect across religions and would bring India together. Whereas those from minority groups, there was a far lower proportion of that. So what these surveys results actually helped us do was to give substance to the chaos, the noise, the white noise that was coming out of claims and counterclaims about what voters believed. So it was our way of picking up a single aspect of electoral politics, that is voter expectations on the eve of the election, and bring clarity to that. And the important point here is that the print media remains one of the platforms on which such in-depth analysis is possible. And from there, obviously, we segued the results. We got into infographics. We presented interactive graphics on our website, which readers could go to from our print edition using a QR code, which allowed readers to go even further and understand the nuances of that data. So again, this goes back to my first point, which is while you're seeing sort of runaway trends in terms of the impact that social media and influencers and specific platforms, as Kiran said about WhatsApp, can have on voter perceptions and voter outcomes even, the print media, and I believe to a great extent even television and broadcast media, have a role to play in terms of their traditional functions, which is bring deeper conversations to the table, bring more data to the table, and embrace the new platforms as well. Find ways to engage with younger readers through your websites, through social media. We also have YouTube and Instagram channels and so forth. So find ways to bring those readers in. That is obviously challenging in this environment, given what we know about shrinking attention spans. But having said all that, I just wanted to strike a slightly more optimistic note about what I said at the beginning, which is there is variation within the media sector in terms of what those from the traditional or old school media houses are still able to do in the current environment, and the impact that they have on entirely digital and social media type election as the 2024 one has proved to be. So I'll leave it there, and we can come back to more questions on print media in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Narayan, for that detailed presentation and striking a note of optimism on at least the print media and the older media houses and the way they cover not just election but news in general. So we have maybe 15 minutes or so because it was a larger panel than usual. for Q&A, and we already have some questions coming in. Before I turn to those, I had a quick question, just to go back to, Kishila's comment on this, the 2024 election being, a boring election. This is, something that I heard when I was in India, over the last couple of weeks, and tying that into, Shahana's, point about complementarity and the synergy between, physical campaigning and online campaigning. So could I just throw a question? Maybe maybe I'll turn to Shahana first, and others are welcome to step in. On do you see, even though you talked about the synergy, do you see increasingly sort of in online campaigning becoming the sort of norm, and physical campaigning shrinking, or does your research actually does not point in that direction?
So I mean, my research does not, because my research was conducted earlier. So this research is not based on the ongoing election campaign. But in the span of the election campaigns that I covered in my research, that was like from 2019 to 2022, primarily the state election campaigns, I did actually see quite a lot of that synergy between online components of campaigning as well as the in-person forms of campaigning, particularly mass campaign rallies. And I think to some extent, what I can tell, even though I'm only observing things remotely during the current election, I do see some of that complementarity still playing out on on social media. There have been several campaign rally speeches, etc., which have been relayed several times over on social media in the past weeks and have become points of discussion. So, I think as far as some of the mass campaign rallies are concerned, we are still seeing some of that synergy between those and, some of the online campaigning engagement on social media, I think. So, yeah.
Right. Okay, thanks. I'll just maybe turn to the audience questions since we have limited time. So there's one for Naresh. I think Naresh has already answered that. I'm not sure whether the Q&A section can be...
I'd be glad to take that question, actually. As I just answered, somebody asked me.
Yeah, why don't you take that? Because I'm not sure whether everyone can see your answer. Yeah.
Somebody just asked me why the independent media actually is seen as a mouthpiece for the opposition, why it's seen as soliciting votes for the opposition, and whether there is no case for neutral media anymore. To which I answered, actually, I think the independent media stands for the values of the Constitution. And that is the framework within which we operate. I would be curious to see an example of somebody soliciting votes for an opposition party. I'm always curious about the origins of this perception because I cannot see much evidence of it myself.
Right. Okay.
If I can just add, I think
go ahead,
to the same question.
Yeah.
I think we're at that the underlying assumption or supposition that comes out of what Naresh has said is the Constitution itself is now become a major debate in the sense it is widely anticipated that with a third term for the BJP, it is quite, though they have said they would not do so, it is quite likely and possible that we might see, depending on the numbers they win in the Lok Sabha, changes to the Constitution, amendments that actually impact some aspects of the Constitution. There is the basic structure doctrine, which makes it harder for them to change what is, in a sense, the DNA of the Constitution. But in the face of overwhelming support from the voters, which is what is actually the most concerning aspect of this whole process from a democratic standpoint, with that support, it is possible for a party to change the very manual by which the country is run And I think tomorrow, therefore, the media might have to contemplate operating according by very different rules if that actually happens. I think that is sort of the doomsday scenario from a democratic standpoint for a free press, since that's the question we're taking up today. And that is why today you're hearing these sorts of questions, which have just come up now as well, which relate to if you're not with us, you're against us, because there's really no such thing as being with the Constitution.
Right. Thanks, Narayan and Naresh. So there are a couple of more questions. One directed at both Naresh and Kishal, and just quickly read it out. The question is, how do you categorize the proposed Broadcasting Services Regulation Bill, which was passed in November last year, and the impact it will possibly have going forward? Does it mark another shift towards further centralization and control over the media, including independent media? Naresh, do you want to go first, or?
Sure, yes. As many journalist organizations have said in critiques of this bill, it's sort of the gateway to censorship. It conflates terms, it puts many different categories within the same bracket, and it's just sort of a recipe for chaos. Among other things, for instance, it would also add a great burden to small organizations which have to set up these grievance committees, for instance, to be able to respond to queries or objections that somebody may have with a story you've run. And this is just an enormous burden. There's a time frame within which these have to be responded to. It means hiring somebody. You could be flooded, as we often are, by organized campaigns to bog you down. I mean, this is just the smallest way in which these rules could just knock us out of operation.
Right. Kishal, any thoughts on the broadcasting bill?
I mean, Ranaja, just to put it into perspective, when we used to do news on NDTV, the old NDTV, I used to produce a show called Good Morning India in the morning, which was a live breakfast show, and then we used to have something called News Tonight at 9 o'clock. It wasn't a 24-hour news.
Yeah.
And there was a rider that would take the tape recorded from the office to the Mandi house and play it. Within the 15 minutes before the news would play, the censored would actually identify words that they did not like, and we would do something called audio dipping, because you couldn't really replace and change anything. For the morning show, 2 censors would actually come, and they were called censors. I mean, that was the word that were used. They would come and sit in our office and enjoy a very hearty breakfast that we would serve to everyone. And they would then identify that this is not okay, this is not okay, this is not okay. It didn't really, I don't think so, it cut down or reduced our journalistic practices in any way. Because, we were, I mean, when you're writing a piece, when you're reporting a piece, you're yourself careful. You're anyway self-censoring, and not being jingoistic, not the kind of stuff that you see today. So I think those are practices that are embedded in classical journalistic practices. And I don't think I am sanguine, and I may be just the last one standing out here. And I hope I have Naresh and a few others holding hands in that, of saying that the ground reportage, the classical way of doing journalism is going to survive. That's what we need. That should dominate when we talk about impact of media and journalism. More and more resource is always going to be a crunch, and independent media is always going to face that trouble. And I believe that, that unless we figure out the revenue model or the way we get the funding for news journalism, it is going to be corporatized, it is going to be coerced. There is no way out of being. If it is not this government, it's going to be another government. It is not this corporation, it's going to be another corporation. You are the beck and call of people who are going to give you money. And then that is why the independent journalism needs to be made more robust, needs support. I don't know, Naresh should be in a better position to explain that, but I think it comes down to the revenue structure. And I hope that more and more research is done, not to tell me that there is no revenue structure. I know that there is no revenue structure, but to be able to tell me what is the alternative. And and there is an alternative for everything else in the world except for news journalism. This is also something that I can't believe economists have not. I mean, economists have not cracked a lot of things, but amongst them, one of them is about the revenue of news journalism.
Right. So we have a sort of interrelated questions for Shahana and Kiran, and I just read it quickly. So, question is, what your data tells you how organized these messaging operations are, or how important are the much talked about IT cells of the various party, or is this much more organic and locally organized? Also, apart from the BJP, do you see the other parties utilizing such methods of political messaging, and if so, how would it be different in terms of their content? A large question. Kiran, would you like to go first, and then I can
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's well known. So there's only one party that has this sort of infrastructure at this scale. It's also not just that, they have the infrastructure. Like if today, if you give the same resources and money to Congress or, any of the other people, it's just also the support it has top down, like I mean, these kinds of infrastructure and investments were made by the BJP. You have to give it to them, like, over a decade ago, right? Like, and it is sustained. Like, it's not just that during the election, there's content that is being created and spread. They have this content like that is spreading all the time. And again, like I said, like just the fact that you have these IT cells that create content doesn't mean anything, especially on a platform like WhatsApp, because unless people really like your content, believe it, and spread it, like it will not spread to the normal people, which is the huge population in India, right? Like, so in that sense, I mean, we have evidence that shows that, okay, BJP is really good at it, really impactful. The other parties may have like some IT cells, but they're not effective at all. We do not see at all, like, probably orders of magnitude lower in terms of their reach and virality of the content that we see, especially in our data.
Right. Shana, any quick thoughts on that? IT cells and the efficacy and BJP vis-a-vis other parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think, WhatsApp in particular is something that Kiran has studied in much, much greater depth than I have. So I may not be able to speak too much to that. But I think, yeah, it's about right that there are other parties that have also invested in creating some of that WhatsApp infrastructure, especially in recent years, but it is perhaps not as sustained and it may not have as many people as Kiran was correctly pointing out, because, on WhatsApp, really, it's a lot about how many people are, getting that content out and, that multiplier effect. It's really all about that. So I think other parties have, started working on it, but a lot of that sort of machinery really comes in in the months just prior to election, and rather than kind of being sustained over months and months after. So it's there, but maybe certainly not to the same scale and extent as we have seen with the BJP. However, I do want to just take a minute to say that I think with some of the regionally, strong parties, especially during state elections, we have seen that, and these are like the non-BJP parties, we have seen that they are actually able to create a pretty strong infrastructure, including the people. Especially, for example, the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi is one case in point, which is a part of my field work that I study very closely. And so there are, in more urbanized spaces there are certain pockets where there are non-BJP parties which are still able to create some of that very strong presence, even on WhatsApp. Yeah.
So we have one last question which just came in, and I'll quickly read it out. It's on, news anchors and the complicity of certain news anchors and giving a free pass to the ruling dispensation. should that be seen as merely tactical or strategic out of some fear, psychosis, or is it more ideologically driven? How they sort of internalize the communal vitriol and they actually believe in what they say. So any quick responses? Kishal, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's firstly opportunistic. I think newsrooms, like I said, that journalists were always, there was opportunism always available, and people have taken now it's much more in the face. It's like, going to an Oxford Union and, making a speech, which is, like I said, that the IS officer who's retired, who's done very well for himself. His entire lecture was like an election speech. So news anchors, or whether it's people in the services or wherever, everyone's taken on the role of being the campaigner. And and partly I think that's it's not fear as much, but it could be, it could be a combination of all, but I think opportunism is where I will put that as a first.
Right. So we've really run out of time, but I just wanted to go back to one issue which ironically was also present in our first webinar, which was on whether the election result is a foregone conclusion. This was 6 weeks ago, and Narayan had expressed the hope that the electoral bonds issue would be something that possibly be sort of played up by the media and might have an impact on the voters. And we don't really see that. And I think some of you referred to that and why and how the electoral bonds has not been an issue. So, some quick concluding thoughts on the electoral bonds issue, either from Narayan or anyone else, on why it really did not, become the kind of issue that people had, felt that it might. Is it sort of due to voter apathy, or was it due to the media organizations not doing enough to put it out? Any quick thoughts, Narayan, Naresh? Narayan, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So again, not just to highlight the Hindu because I'm there, but we were among a few of the houses that did an in-depth analysis. In fact, we produced some of those details even before SBI got its act together, and we published all the details, everything that we had in terms of what everyone was seeking in terms of transparency around the bonds. I think, look, broadly, it is a cultural. It is a culture that pervades politics today that allows such egregious actions to pass as normal, because it has become a culture that says, if it doesn't really affect me, why should I care? So again, that goes back to very deep questions which we are going to have to reckon with at some stage, which is, do you want to actually, as a democracy, hold your political class accountable? Or have you become so transactional that it is only what hits your pocket at the end of the day that matters? So, but even there, is that even matter? For example, demonetization. It actually hit a lot of people's pockets. And just talk about mundane inconvenience that was inflicted on the middle class. There wasn't a whisper of protest. Everybody lined up, everybody returned their notes, everybody went on with business as usual as if nothing had happened. So I think there has been a sort of a major shift in just the mindset about how the common Indian views the political class. And it has now gone into completely new sort of pathways, as I said earlier, blurring the line between news and entertainment, where social media influencers have an outsized impact on how people behave. So I think the electoral bonds was actually, if you ask me, a tiny ripple that just got swept away in this broader shifted mindset, which is willing to overlook major scandals and crises like this, even when media are working diligently to bring data and facts to the public's attention. I don't know what more to say than that. It's an enormous frustration that we're working with, because it's pretty much like you can't do anything about it.
Right. Naresh, any concluding thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, the sort of one of the mottos of journalism has always been that the people shall know. And the people do know. And as Narayan said, one of the great frustrations is that the people do not act. The power of the press is a cliche until it's backed by public action and public opinion. And that now seems to be the gap that we haven't figured out how to bridge.
Thank you for that excellent discussion. We are really out of time, and thanks once again for sparing your time across time zones. For some of you, it was very inconvenient to take part in this discussion. We plan to be back with a post-election result analysis after June 4th. We'll keep you posted on that. Do join us if you are free, and let's have a round of virtual applause for the panelists as well as the audience who hung in right till the end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
John.
you. Thank you.
See you. Bye.